January of 1945. The Eastern Front stretches from the Baltic to the Carpathians. Face to face stand two military colossi, more than 6 million Soviet soldiers deployed across three principal fronts, with 20,000 artillery pieces and more than 8,000 armored vehicles, and a German army which, although exhausted, still retains elite armored formations scattered between Poland and Hungary. The Reich enters this final year with a paradox. Its war industry continues to produce weapons in considerable numbers, yet it lacks the most vital resource of all: fuel. The loss of the Romanian oil fields in August of 1944 condemns any prolonged maneuver. Every German offensive in these months will be an exercise in calculated risk, with tanks that have barely enough fuel to advance for a few days, or merely a few hours. The Volksgrenadier divisions, reduced in manpower yet equipped with STG-44 assault rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, become the backbone of the infantry. At their side, the Volkssturm is improvised, composed of elderly men and teenagers. These formations provide human volume, but not the fighting quality of the divisions of 1941 or 1942. German armoured strength has also changed. The Panzer IV, the Panther and the Tiger represent the technological pinnacle of the Wehrmacht, but their crews lack sufficient training and adequate air support. The Luftwaffe, decimated and without fuel, can scarcely offer cover. The skies now belong to the Red Army. Within this scenario, Hitler and his high command conceive a series of counteroffensives that defy all operational logic. They are sudden strikes intended to rescue encircled garrisons, secure the last oil wells in Hungary, or delay the Soviet approach to the Oder, 70 kilometers from Berlin. Germany is defeated but not yet destroyed. And in that month of January in Budapest, on the Oder, in the Hungarian plains, the Reich will launch its final attacks on the Eastern Front. December the 24th, 1944. The Soviet armies close the encirclement around Budapest. 100,000 German and Hungarian soldiers, together with almost 500,000 civilians, are trapped in a city turned into an improvised fortress. The comparison with Stalingrad is immediate, and it is no coincidence. Once again, Hitler orders resistance to the last man, forbidding any withdrawal, relying on a counter-offensive to break the siege. The Reich clings to Hungary for two reasons. The first is symbolic. Its last ally in Central Europe could not be allowed to fall without a fight. The second is brutally material. Beneath Hungarian soil, there still remained operational oil wells. Without them, the German war machine would grind to a halt. Hitler knew this and repeated it in his meetings. Without fuel, we cannot continue mechanized warfare. Meanwhile, the 6th Panzer Army of the Waffen-SS, withdrawn from the Ardennes, receives the order to transfer at full speed towards the Danube. Yet time is against them. In the first days of January, the only formation available is the 4th SS Panzer Corps under General Otto Gille, with two elite divisions, Totenkopf and Wiking. Hardened men, but exhausted. With scarcely half of their operational strength, they had expected a Christmas in relative calm in Poland. Instead, they were hurled on a journey into the heart of Hungary, towards a fate that many already sensed as a death sentence. The year begins with fire. On the 1st of January, 1945, while in Berlin, hollow formulas of final victory are still repeated, the 4th SS Panzer Corps of General Otto Gille receives the order, break the encirclement of Budapest. His two divisions, Totenkopf and Wiking, seasoned yet depleted, set out towards the Hungarian capital. They are neither complete nor fully armed, nor supplied with the fuel reserves that such an undertaking would require. But urgency dictates action. The chosen maneuver is the shortest, but also the most difficult, a frontal attack from Pomerania across the Retraces and Gerekse mountain ranges. Hostile ground for armor, where snow, mud, and the absence of proper roads turn every kilometer into a struggle against the environment itself. The High Command in Berlin does not consider wider alternatives. There is neither time nor resources. The first days catch the Soviets by surprise. The Totenkopf opens the way with concentrated artillery fire and Panther tanks. The Wiking, composed largely of European volunteers, advances with a ferocity that recalls, for an instant, the campaigns of 1941. Soviet units are overrun in swift ambushes. Villages and hamlets change hands several times within hours. The echo of panzer engines resounds through the snow-covered valleys, and for entire days the impossible seems attainable: to reach Budapest. But the illusion quickly dissolves. The central problem is not the frontal clash, but the abandoned flanks. The shortage of infantry turns each advance into a vulnerable corridor. Isolated Soviet groups, instead of retreating, conceal themselves in mountains and forests, reorganizing in the German rear. There they attack convoys, destroy fuel trucks, harass ambulances, and slowly drag the offensive towards collapse. Gila's reports describe the dilemma with brutal clarity. We have tanks, but we lack the infantry needed to secure the ground we capture. The supply columns are annihilated before reaching the front. The panzer crews themselves sense the trap. Every advance leaves them more isolated, with less ammunition and less fuel. Fuel becomes a tyrant. The reserves scarcely permit the offensive to continue for a few days. In many sectors, panzers must halt simply because there is no petrol to move forward. Without mobility, the armored vehicle becomes an immobile fortress, condemned to Soviet fire. On the 8th of January, Operation Conrad I halts. The offensive has stalled halfway, far too distant to relieve the 100,000 soldiers and 400,000 civilians trapped in Budapest. From inside the city, the besieged observe the flames of battle on the horizon, believing that rescue is near. They do not know it is already too late. The toll is devastating. Thousands of irreplaceable casualties, a generation of veterans sacrificed in an assault that never had any real chance of success. Conrad I reveals the pattern that will define the Reich's final offensives. A blazing start, tactical surprise, but structural collapse. The Reich can still strike fiercely, but it can no longer sustain the blow. Hungary reveals itself from the very first day of the year as the slaughterhouse of the German army. The failure of the first offensive does not stop the High Command. Barely days after the withdrawal from Conrad I, Hitler insists Budapest must be liberated at any cost. It is not only about the 100,000 men trapped in the city, but about the Führer's own political logic. No fortress can fall, no ally can be abandoned, and least of all, when beneath the soil still pulses Hungarian oil, the Reich's last fuel. On the 7th of January, the 4th SS Panzer Corps reorganizes for a second attempt. This time the attack is not launched frontally, but further north, from the Pilis mountain region. The Viking division, already reduced to less than half its initial strength, is designated as the Spearhead, a single elite division to break through in rugged, snow-covered terrain, with frozen roads and forests that absorb any attempt at armored maneuver. The operation depends on surprise. At first, it achieves it. The Soviet vanguards, confident after halting the Germans in the Retraces mountains, are overrun. The Wiking advances with desperate violence, fighting in villages that change hands several times in a single day. The Soviets fall back a few kilometers, bewildered by the audacity of an offensive they had thought impossible. But reality soon asserts itself. One isolated division cannot pierce the Soviet front. The frozen, narrow roads turn the advance into a corridor only a few hundred meters wide, a fragile vein beating on the edge of collapse. Soviet artillery concentrates its fire on this passage, while reserves begin to flow in from the Budapest encirclement. The Viking's own commander describes the situation in his reports. Our armored vehicles advance, but the terrain does not allow deployment. The columns are jammed. Casualties increase without any possibility of relief. Morale, which at first had burned with the illusion of rescuing their comrades, breaks as the days slip into a cycle of assault, withdrawal, and stagnation. The besieged in Budapest wait. From the Buda Hills, Hungarian observers report fighting less than 20 kilometers away. Some believe they can hear the friendly artillery. Rumor spreads through the city under siege. The Viking is coming to rescue us. But that hope lasts only briefly. On the 12th of January, Operation Conrad II halts. The Soviets have sealed the corridor with concentrated fire. The Viking division, exhausted and bleeding men in every clash, receives the order to withdraw. In practice, this means that Budapest is left to its fate. The operation, which lasted only a few days, ends with a terrible balance. Hundreds of tanks immobilized for lack of fuel or destroyed in ambushes. Infantry companies reduced to half strength. Veteran officers replaced by inexperienced youths. The psychological scar is deeper still. The men know that the next order will be to attack once again. The failure of Conrad II demonstrates the strategic blindness of a Reich in decomposition. Without sufficient forces, without fuel, with divisions reduced to half strength, Hitler orders the same effort repeated, expecting a different outcome. The only change is the number of corpses left upon the snow. Military logic dictated a halt. The 4th SS Panzer Corps was exhausted. Totenkopf and Viking had lost the greater part of their strength in the two previous attempts. The fuel reserves had been reduced to the indispensable minimum. The infantry was insufficient to secure the flanks. But in Berlin, the word withdrawal did not exist. Hitler demanded a third attempt, the most ambitious of all, Operation Conrad III. The plan was simple on paper. Instead of a limited frontal blow, now several panzer and infantry divisions would be concentrated in a massive effort south of Budapest, between Lake Velence and Lake Balaton. It was an open sector, favorable to armored warfare, where initial surprise might achieve a decisive breakthrough. Otto Giller himself described it as the last chance to liberate the garrison. On the 18th of January 1945, the offensive began. Unlike the previous attempts, the concentration of resources was greater. Alongside Totenkopf and Viking were added the 23rd Panzer Division, the reinforced 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, and several infantry divisions. During the first days, the attack was devastating. The Soviets, once again taken by surprise, fell back. German armor managed to penetrate deeply into enemy lines, reaching the shores of Lake Velence and bypassing Soviet positions to the north. For a moment, the impossible seemed attainable. Budapest lay scarcely more than 20 kilometers away. The encircled, in intermittent radio contact, received word that German columns were advancing. Jubilation mingled with despair. The besieged men hoped that after 1 month of confinement, salvation was within reach. But the offensive wore down swiftly. The strategic dilemma opened at the very heart of the German command. Should they continue towards Budapest and risk everything in a narrow corridor, or turn northwards and attempt to envelop the Soviet armies threatening their flanks? The debate dragged on while the hours passed. Each day of indecision allowed the Soviets to regroup reserves and reinforce their lines. Meanwhile, German logistics collapsed. Fuel was exhausted to the point that many tanks had to be abandoned in the middle of the offensive. A panzer company commander wrote in his diary, "We advanced with 10 tanks. Only 3 reached the front line. The rest were left without petrol on the road." The rear became a hell of Soviet ambushes, with burning trucks and shattered supply columns. By the end of January, the offensive had lost all momentum. The Soviets, now fully reinforced, launched coordinated counterattacks from the north and east. The German corridor narrowed to the very edge of survival. On the 27th of January, the order was explicit: withdrawal. The dream of liberating Budapest was collapsing definitively. The price was immense. It is estimated that the 4th SS Panzer Corps and its associated divisions suffered tens of thousands of casualties in 3 weeks of uninterrupted fighting. Armored strength was reduced to a skeleton. Companies that once fielded 30 tanks could now muster barely 5 or 6. In Budapest, the reaction was devastating. The besieged understood there would be no rescue. Fighting inside the city intensified, but hope was extinguished. For them, the failure of Conrad III was equivalent to a death sentence. Conrad III marked the end of German illusions in Hungary. What followed would no longer be rescue attempts, but the preparation for the Reich's final great offensive, Operation Spring Awakening. February of 1945 had closed the chapter of hope for Budapest. The Hungarian capital fell amid ruins and hunger, and with it evaporated the last defensive cushion of the Reich on the Middle Danube. Yet Hitler clung to another fiction. As long as the oil fields of Nagy Kanica and the industrial belt stretching west of Lake Balaton survived, the mechanical heart of the war could be kept alive. The argument was not only economic, it was also political. Frühlingswaffen had to be a gesture. The Reich still knew how to attack, still could choose the moment and the place. A prestige offensive for its own people and a warning to the Allies. The choice of battleground was rich in symbolism and cruel in realism. The early thaw of March turned the black Hungarian earth into a thick mire that swallowed boots, mules, trucks, and dreams. To attack, there was to demand from the armored divisions an effort for which there no longer existed sufficient fuel, spare parts, or veteran crews. Even so, the order descended through the chain of command with the same blunt force as in 1941. Attack. The core of the offensive was the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, freshly pulled from the Western Front after the failure of the Ardennes. Its 4 elite divisions, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Hohenstaufen, Hitlerjugend, provided the shock backbone. Alongside them, elements of the 2nd Panzer Army and the 6th Army of the Wehrmacht were to press the front in secondary sectors, provide artillery, and hold the lines once the breach was forced. On paper, around 200,000 men and more than 400 armored vehicles, Panther, some Tiger II, and self-propelled artillery. In reality, depleted rosters, overwhelmed workshops, drivers and gunners with accelerated training, depots emptied every night, and a spectral Luftwaffe incapable of ensuring even routine daytime patrols. Opposite them, the Soviets were not surprised. The 2nd Ukrainian Front under Rodion Malinovsky and the 3rd Ukrainian Front under Fyodor Tolbukin had been alerted by intelligence reports, among them pieces supplied by the Hungarian resistance, and had fortified the sector weeks in advance. 500,000 men, thousands of guns, and 1,200 tanks with absolute air supremacy. In the battle that was coming, the sky would dictate the very breathing of the earth. The operation was born shackled by 2 burdens, mud and petrol. The mud turned every track into a ditch, every roadside into a swamp. The Tiger II, colossal and formidable on firm ground, became immobile monoliths, beacon targets for enemy artillery. The Panther, more agile, could maneuver only at the cost of devouring fuel that never arrived on time. Engineers opened passages with logs and planks. The next night, the rain restored the mire to its starting point. Fuel dictated tactics. Timed stages, advance 10 to 15 kilometers, halt for refueling, begin again. But the rear was a deadly corridor. narrow roads clogged with refugees, fragile bridges, improvised fuel depots in barrels that ignited at the lightest Soviet air raid, and tanker trucks hunted by the VVS. In the reports of mechanized battalions, the same refrain appears. The plan is correct. The petrol, insufficient. The offensive began on the 6th of March. In the first 2 days, the Germans broke the forward lines of the 26th Soviet Army, captured Sergelies and Székesfehérvár, and pushed 25 to 30 kilometers towards the south and southeast. The Leibstandarte and the Das Reich annihilated resistance nodes with point-blank direct fire. The Hitlerjugend, blooded in Normandy, but now far below its former strength, expended its ammunition in short duels across farms and hedgerows. The Hohenstaufen alternated support and raids against Soviet columns, trying to form a new defense. On the maps in the German command post, thick arrows pointed towards the Danube. The echo of the advance traveled as far as Budapest and Vienna. For an instant, the propaganda machinery believed it could fabricate a rebirth. On the ground, the image was another. Panthers advancing in single file along muddy lanes, Tiger II rescued by tractors that never arrived, armored cars boxed in ruined villages, gunners saturating crossroads with smoke to cover refueling operations. Logistics exacted its toll at once. Units that began with 20 tanks reached the front with 10. The rest were left broken down, bogged down, or dry along the route. Fuel lost to bombardment was never recovered. The motorized infantry fell behind. When it caught up with the spearhead, the front line had already shifted. Sappers worked in full view of the enemy. They fell, others came forward, and they too fell. On the 10th of March, the culmination point was reached. German penetrations brushed against sensitive communication lines. The Soviets gave ground elastically, and as they yielded, punished with massive artillery fire. On the German radio, tactical debates betrayed the fatigue of command. Should they push towards the Danube or consolidate? Every additional kilometer demanded liters that did not exist and infantry that did not arrive. Every hour without decision allowed Malinovsky and Tolbukin to inject reserves. Guards, tank brigades, anti-tank regiments in fan formation, Katyusha batteries echeloned along the approaches. The Luftwaffe did not appear. A few Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters took off in short sorties. Most did not reach the sector or could not remain there. The VVS, on the other hand, hammered crossroads, truck convoys, ammunition parks, and located with watchmakers' precision the refueling points, now marked by the oily smoke of burning fuel. On the 15th of March, the Red Army delivered its reply. From 3 sectors, battalions of T-34 85 tanks and Su-100 assault guns struck the German wedges, first at distance with overlapping fire, then at close quarters in the villages just captured. The pattern repeated itself, frontal fixation with artillery, flanking blows to separate spearheads from their supports, and road cuts in the rear. The Hitlerjugend entrenched itself in stone houses. The Das Reich organized Kampfgruppen with whatever remained of its companies. The Leibstandarte sacrificed the last Tiger II to open corridors of withdrawal. The Hohenstaufen covered with desperate bites every stream crossing. The consumption reports were the obituary of the offensive. Companies beginning the day with 300 liters per tank and ending with 20. Trucks buried in mud up to the axle. Tractors captured or destroyed, broken tracks with no spare links. Too often the final order was not withdraw, but abandon and destroy. By the 19th of March, the retreat was a fact. There were no operational reserves to launch. The German line ebbed back towards the west of Lake Valence, then towards Lake Balaton, finally into positions that no longer deserved the name. Resistance lines built from company remnants, anti-tank guns spaced wide apart, and machine gun nests shifting each night to feign depth. The cost was irrecoverable. In less than 2 weeks, the Reich lost tens of thousands of men, many of them veterans, and almost half of the armored vehicles committed. Battalions that at dawn could field 30 tanks barely gathered 5 or 6 by nightfall. Self-propelled artillery was reduced to wrecks, useless for lack of parts and forward workshops. In the material listings, entire columns appeared marked "abandoned without fuel." The psychology of the troops faltered. Not from cowardice, resistance was ferocious, but from the collective perception of fighting into a void. Every meter conquered was lost the following week. Every tiger rescued would be a target tomorrow. Every man saved would return to a line poorer than the one he had left. Hitler's response was an explosion of rage. In situation conferences, he accused SS divisions of treason, declared they had not fought with sufficient harshness, and demanded perseverance on ground that returned nothing but corpses. The field generals remained silent. In their notebooks, they recorded only petrol, mud, and an enemy sky. What failed was not the will, but the arithmetic of war when logistics and air belonged to the adversary. The symbolic blow was profound. The Waffen-SS, treated for years as the spearhead and the reservoir of fanaticism, now appeared naked, without aviation, without fuel, without reserves. They were a fist that could strike only once before breaking. The defeat left Army Group South without maneuver force. The positions west of Lake Balaton became untenable. The operational line stretched, tore, and through those gaps Malinovsky's and Tolbukin's armies penetrated into Austria. On the 13th of April, 1945, Vienna fell. The city that was to be shielded by the Spring Awakening became its epitaph. Behind Vienna, there were no buffers, only the road to the Alps, and to the north, the final agony in Berlin. Frühlingserwachen failed not through one cause, but through the sum. Enemy intelligence anticipating the blow, terrain multiplying attrition, logistics unable to sustain the pace, Soviet air superiority turning every crossroads into a trap, and unit rosters no longer those of 1943. It was the inverted mirror of 1941, where once there was depth, now only surface. Where once there was method, now only urgency. Where once the sky was contested, now it was lost. The offensive that was to protect the oil ended by devouring the remaining fuel. The one that was to restore the prestige of German armored forces ended by dismantling them as a decisive instrument. After Balaton, the Reich could still kill, but could no longer win. And with each passing day, it killed less and died more. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, the Third Reich found itself in a military and industrial paradox. While the enemy advanced from every front and German territory shrank day by day, the war machine reached, in terms of production, its peak. Under the direction of Albert Speer, the armaments industry manufactured more tanks, more aircraft, and more individual weapons in 1944 than in any previous year of the war. Yet this apparent abundance concealed a devastating truth. Every new tank, every new rifle, every new aircraft lacked the essentials for campaigning. Romanian oil, lost in August of 1944 after the Soviet offensive in the Carpathians, had been the coup de grace. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pölitz, bombed day and night by Allied aviation, produced only fractions of the necessary volume. Tanks without petrol, fighters without kerosene, motorized divisions reduced to marching columns on foot. That was the reality of the German army in its final months. The manpower crisis was met with improvised solutions. In the autumn of 1944 appeared the Volksgrenadier divisions, created to replace formations shattered in Normandy and on the Eastern Front. These were smaller divisions, with around 10,000 men instead of the 15,000 of a standard division, but armed with a high density of automatic weapons. Each battalion received plentiful Sturmgewehr, 44 assault rifles, the first weapon of its kind in the world, and Panzerfaust anti-tank launchers capable of destroying a T-34 at close range. On paper, these formations were more modern and lethal. In practice, they lacked training, cohesion, and experience. They were composed of soldiers recovered from hospitals, of young recruits barely instructed, and of officers hastily reassigned. In combat, they could offer intense tactical resistance, but they were incapable of sustaining prolonged operations. Still more desperate was the resort to the Volkssturm, decreed in October of 1944 by Hitler himself. Under this program, every male between 16 and 60 years of age, not already enlisted in the army, was mobilized. The result was brigades composed of Hitlerjugend adolescents and elderly men who had served in the Great War. They wore incomplete uniforms, sometimes mere armbands, and were armed with old rifles, hunting shotguns, and a handful of Panzerfausts distributed in minimal numbers. They were sent to fronts where professional divisions could no longer hold the line, particularly in East Prussia and on the outskirts of Berlin. Their role was more symbolic than real, propaganda of a people in arms, when in fact it was the clearest sign of the Reich's disintegration. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the regime, had ceased to be a decisive force. Allied bombers devastated cities and industrial installations with overwhelming air superiority. The most advanced German fighters, such as the Messerschmitt Me 262, could scarcely take off. The few units constructed remained idle on airfields without fuel, or were flown by young men who received only a few hours of instruction before entering combat. The German Air Force, which in 1940 had flown over Paris and London, by 1945 was a ghost reduced to token raids. The same applied to the armored forces. Production of Panthers and Tiger II reached record levels in 1944, but many crews were inexperienced recruits, superficially trained in overcrowded instruction camps. The losses of veterans at Kursk in Normandy and during the retreat from the Dnieper had emptied the Panzerwaffe of its best men. Technically superior tanks were handed over to crews who did not even know basic procedures of combat coordination. Without fuel, without training, and without air support, their value was drastically reduced. In parallel, attempts at irregular warfare were conceived. The Werewolf Project, launched at the end of 1944, sought to organize a clandestine German resistance in territories occupied by the Allies. Small commandos were trained in sabotage and guerrilla operations, with hidden bases in forests and cities. Yet the scale was ridiculous compared with expectations. Only a few dozen actions were carried out, with marginal effects. The myth of the werewolf survived more in propaganda than in reality, although the Allies used it as justification to impose harsh reprisals in the conquered zones, fearing an insurgency that never materialized. In February of 1945, when the Vistula-Oder offensive had pushed the Red Army to the very gates of Berlin, the German High Command conceived a desperate counterattack in Pomerania. The operation was baptized Solstice, and its direct promoter was Heinz Guderian, chief of the Army General Staff. The plan was audacious: to assemble armored forces north and south of the front and launch a pincer movement, striking the flank of Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, forcing the Soviets to halt their advance on the German capital. The original idea envisaged a concentration of more than 10 panzer divisions, supported by infantry corps and heavy artillery. However, the material reality of 1945 turned that vision into a mirage. The Wehrmacht could scarcely gather scattered forces, many of them already exhausted in the retreat from the Oder. The operation was reduced to a single frontal thrust, directed by the 11th SS Panzer Corps under General Walter Wenck. On the 15th of February 1945, in the depth of a winter dawn, The engines of roughly 1,200 German tanks, the largest concentration since Kursk in 1943, roared in the forests of Stargard and Stettin. Among them were units of the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, the SS Nordland, the Sachsen-Anhalt, together with elements of the 4th Panzer Division and remnants of Volksgrenadier formations. The offensive was launched eastward with the mission of cutting Soviet communications and relieving pressure on the Kustrin front. The first days seemed to promise partial success. Between the 15th and the 17th of February, the Panzer divisions advanced nearly 15 kilometers, capturing villages and surprising scattered Soviet detachments. The snow-covered, forested terrain offered some protection to the German armor, which burst unexpectedly from the trees and struck with surgical precision. Soviet artillery positions were overrun in several instances, and the Volksgrenadier infantry once again proved the effectiveness of their Panzerfausts against T-34s in close combat. But the balance soon shifted. The offensive lacked both depth and reserves. Every kilometer conquered represented a colossal logistical effort. Fuel convoys destroyed by Soviet aviation, roads blocked by German refugees fleeing westward, and a non-existent Luftwaffe unable to prevent Soviet fighters from dominating the skies. On the 18th of February, Zhukov reacted swiftly, diverting the 2nd Guards Tank Army and the 61st Army into the threatened sector. The Soviet counterattack was immediate and brutal. By the 20th of February, the vanguards of the 11th Panzer Corps were already on the defensive. German tanks, without sufficient fuel to maneuver, were flanked by waves of T-34-85s and Su-100 assault guns. Many crews abandoned their vehicles in open fields, unable to move them, while enemy artillery turned the forests into an inferno of explosions. In scarcely 2 days, the initial advance was wiped out. On the 22nd of February, the offensive was over. The Germans had lost more than 25,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, along with hundreds of armored vehicles destroyed or rendered useless. The 11th SS Panzer Corps withdrew to its initial positions. Closely pursued by the Red Army, Operation Solstice, intended to be a strategic flanking blow, was nothing more than a limited frontal assault, incapable of altering the course of the war. Despite its failure, Solstice had an unexpected tactical effect. It delayed Zhukov's final offensive against Berlin by several weeks. The Soviets were forced to divert resources into Pomerania to eliminate the threat, systematically clearing the region in the days that followed. That pause, brief but significant, gave the Germans a moment to reorganize the defense on the Oder. But it did not change the inevitable. In the cinematic narrative of the Reich's final months, Operation Solstice appears as a lightning flash, briefly illuminating a ruined sky. The roar of more than 1,000 panzers in the snowy forests of Pomerania still evoked the force of an army that had once dominated Europe. But in 1945, that roar faded after only a few days, smothered by the reality of a superior enemy, by the lack of fuel, by the absence of reserves, and by the logistical collapse of a Reich that could no longer sustain its own offensives. On the 21st of April 1945, while the Red Army was already fighting in the suburbs of Berlin, some 200 kilometers to the south in Saxony, German forces still retained the capacity to launch a counterattack of considerable scale. The stage was the city of Bautzen, a road junction strategically located between Dresden and Görlitz on the edge of Lusatia. There, the Reich would demonstrate for the last time that it could inflict a significant tactical defeat. The sector was defended mainly by the Second Polish Army, subordinated to Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front. It was a young force, hastily reorganized under Soviet direction, about 80,000 men distributed among 5 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades, equipped with T-34-85 tanks, supported by Soviet artillery. Morale was fragile. Many soldiers were recent conscripts, some of them peasants conscripted from eastern Poland after the Soviet occupation. Facing them, the German High Command had managed to assemble a hardened core of troops, the 20th Panzer Division, with around 70 tanks, mostly Panzer IV and Panther. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen, seasoned in Normandy and Alsace, now reinforced with armored battalions. Elements of the Hermann Göring Division, with self-propelled artillery, and remnants of Volksgrenadier, serving as supporting infantry. In total, about 40,000 men and some 300 armored vehicles, many crewed by veterans who knew how to push each machine to its limits. The offensive began on the 21st of April. Panzer columns struck from the Görlitz area westward, seeking to envelop the Polish forces. The surprise was total. The Second Polish Army did not expect a counterattack of such magnitude when Berlin was already encircled. In the opening hours, Polish defenses were pierced. The German advance reached between 15 and 20 kilometers in a single day, isolating entire regiments. Polish command posts were thrown into disarray. General Karol Świerczewski, commanding the army, lost contact with several divisions and barely managed to escape encirclement with his staff. On the 22nd of April, the city of Bautzen became the epicenter of battle. Polish forces tried to fortify it, supported by several Soviet regiments. The narrow streets and stone houses turned every corner into a strong point. The Germans hurled their grenadiers forward with armor in support, fighting block by block. The 20th Panzer used its Panthers as battering rams, firing point-blank against buildings turned into machine gun nests. Fighting was brutal. Polish infantry defending from cellars and attics, German tanks burning in the avenues, artillery bombarding indiscriminately. After 2 days of savage combat, Bautzen fell into German hands, though reduced to rubble. On the 23rd and 24th of April, the German offensive reached its climax. Panzer columns pushed westward, cutting Polish retreat routes and creating a pocket east of Kamenz. Several entire divisions of the Second Polish Army were trapped inside, attempting uncoordinated breakout efforts. The Germans, veterans of mobile warfare, employed small-scale pincer tactics, allowing enemy columns to advance, then closing the flanks with armored attacks, annihilating the isolated units. Thousands of Polish soldiers were captured in these battles, and many others perished under crossfire. By the 25th of April, the Second Polish Army was practically shattered. Some of its divisions had lost up to 70% of their strength. The 5th Polish Infantry Division was reduced to less than a single operational regiment. The 2nd Armored Brigade lost more than half of its T-34s. Total Polish and Soviet losses at Bautzen exceeded 15,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. German losses were also heavy. About 6,500 men and around 80 armored vehicles, many abandoned for lack of fuel rather than direct destruction. On the 26th of April, the offensive came to a halt. The Germans had achieved their immediate objective to completely disorganize the Second Polish Army, destroy several of its units, and recapture a strategic area around Bautzen. But they lacked reserves to go further. Soviet numerical superiority was absolute, and Konev's forces continued their offensive towards Dresden and Prague. Berlin, already encircled since the 25th of April, derived no benefit from this blow. The Bautzen offensive was, in essence, the Reich's final claw strike. Tactically, it was a German victory, a crushing defeat for the Second Polish Army, remembered for decades as one of the bloodiest operations suffered by Poland under Soviet command. Strategically, it was irrelevant. Berlin remained doomed, the Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Reich had only days left to exist. Cinematically, Bautzen evokes the image of a dying army that, in its final convulsions, could still bite with fury. Columns of panthers advancing through burning villages, Polish soldiers falling prisoner en masse, house-to-house combat in a ruined city, and above all, the brutal contrast between local success and global catastrophe. While the Germans celebrated a victory in Saxony, the heart of their capital burned beneath the Red Army's assault. In April of 1945, the final great Soviet offensive began along the Oder and the Neisse. The German capital lay less than 70 kilometers away, and two marshals competed openly for the honor of being the first to raise the red banner over Berlin. To the north, Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front concentrated more than 1 million men, 3,000 tanks, and 20,000 artillery pieces. To the south, Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front assembled equivalent forces with the same ultimate goal. Stalin, in his calculated style, encouraged the rivalry. He entrusted both with the mission of storming the capital, knowing that this competition would accelerate the fall of the Reich. On the 16th of April 1945, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the assault began. Zhukov hurled his armies directly against the Silo Heights, the final fortified line before Berlin. Soviet artillery saturated the German positions with an unprecedented curtain of fire. Yet the German defense, anchored in the terrain and in positions prepared by General Heinrici, held out for 3 days. Volksgrenadier troops, Hitlerjugend boys, and remnants of panzer divisions fought house by house in the villages at the foot of the hills, slowing the advance with Panzerfausts and light artillery. On the 19th of April, Zhukov finally broke through the defenses, but at a tremendous cost. Thousands of casualties and hundreds of armored vehicles destroyed. Meanwhile, in the south, Konev's attack across the Neisse advanced much more rapidly. In only 2 days, he pierced the German front, outflanked the defensive lines, and swung northwest, moving directly towards Berlin's outskirts. The rivalry between Zhukov and Konev then reached its peak. Stalin authorized Konev to continue towards the capital, deliberately feeding the competition of his marshals. Thus, Berlin was about to be struck by two colossi at the same time, each obsessed with outpacing the other. In this context, the German Ninth Army, under the command of Theodor Busse, became trapped in the Halbe region. Encircled between Zhukov's and Konev's forces, it became the core of one of the last tragedies of the Eastern Front. More than 200,000 German soldiers, accompanied by tens of thousands of fleeing civilians, were surrounded in the forests and marshes of the Spreewald. For days, from the 24th to the 30th of April, they tried to break westward to surrender to the Americans. The result was a slaughter. Entire columns shattered by artillery, Panther and Tiger tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, hand-to-hand combat amid pines shredded by explosions. Only scattered groups managed to break through. Most were annihilated in Halbe. In Berlin itself, meanwhile, Hitler continued to demand imaginary counteroffensives. On the maps of the Führerbunker, arrows still depicted attacks by 3 different armies. He ordered Steiner in the north to strike with a non-existent corps. He demanded that Wenck, with the 12th Army on the Elbe, wheel east to relieve the capital, and he instructed Busse from Halbe to break the encirclement and march on Berlin. None of these operations was viable. Steiner had only scattered battalions, Wenck was too far away and pressed by the Americans, and Busse was struggling to survive in an encircled pocket. These were impossible plans, born in the mind of a dictator detached from reality. The lack of troops, the shortage of fuel, and the complete absence of coordination turned any notion of a coordinated counteroffensive into fantasy. On the ground, what remained of the Wehrmacht consumed itself in isolated battles, without communications, without reserves, without any possibility of altering the course of events. Thus, in the second half of April 1945, while Zhukov and Konev competed savagely to be the first into Berlin, the Ninth Army bled to death at Halbe, and Hitler sketched counteroffensives that never existed. The final Soviet assault not only crushed the capital's defenses, it exposed the total collapse of German military power, reduced to empty orders, soldiers without fuel, and a resistance extinguished beneath the avalanche of Red Army steel and manpower. In the last days of April 1945, Berlin was already a field of ruins under the incessant fire of Soviet artillery. Avenues were barricaded with overturned trams, beams, and sandbags. Basements were converted into resistance bunkers. Bridges over the Spree were blown up to slow the enemy advance. Amid that apocalyptic landscape, the power of the Reich was reduced to the underground halls of the Chancellery, where Hitler held ever more delusional meetings with his generals and ministers. In that claustrophobic shelter, the dictator clung to the belief that a counteroffensive could still save the capital. The plan, most often repeated, was Steiner's offensive. Supposedly, General Felix Steiner was to regroup forces north of Berlin and launch an attack, striking the Soviet armies from the rear. On the maps spread across the operations table, Hitler traced arrows depicting imaginary advances. But in practice, Steiner had no troops. His units were reduced to fragments, exhausted and without fuel. The Steiner attack never existed, except as a desperate propaganda device and as an illusion in the mind of a leader already divorced from reality. The generals still holding positions understood the war was lost. While Hitler insisted on fighting to the end, many commanders sought surrender to the Western Allies rather than to the Soviets. To the west, Wenck's 12th Army advanced towards the Elbe, not to rescue Berlin, but to open a corridor of surrender to the Americans. To the east, the remnants of Buss's 9th Army, trapped in Halbe, fought to escape the encirclement with the same goal: to break through Soviet lines and give themselves up to the Americans. Disobedience was tacit, officers outwardly obeying Hitler's orders, but secretly leading their men westward, towards a surrender less cruel than that offered by the Red Army. Berlin by then was already completely encircled. On the 25th of April, 1945, Soviet vanguards closed the ring around the city. In the following days, the assault became house by house, block by block. Tiger II tanks fought in the avenues until their last rounds were spent. Hitlerjugend adolescents ambushed T-34s with Panzerfausts from ruined doorways. Volkssturm old men died beside anti-aircraft guns reused as anti-tank weapons in open squares. Resistance was fierce, but every street taken by the Soviets reduced the defenders' space to maneuver. On the 30th of April, with the Reichstag already under assault and Soviet troops less than 500 meters from the Chancellery, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. His death did not halt the battle, but it marked the definitive collapse of the German command structure. On the 2nd of May, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense, capitulated to the Soviets. The city had been reduced to ashes. More than 90,000 German soldiers fell prisoner, tens of thousands died in combat, and the civilian population suffered losses beyond calculation. The fall of Berlin symbolized the fall of the Reich. Those final days revealed the absolute contrast between the illusory plans of a dictator entombed in a bunker and the tangible reality of an army exhausted, without troops, without fuel, without coordination, fighting among ruins to the end. It was the epilogue of a total war. A state that had sought to dominate Europe reduced to dust beneath the red banner flying over the Reichstag.